Hello A-level students and welcome to another lesson in a series of lessons that examines the construction of perspective in The Handmaid's Tale. This lesson is going to examine the role of Deixis in The Handmaid's Tale, and we're going to explore the way that Offred's language creates a sense of time and place and personal identity. We've already looked at grammar and grammatical perspective if you go back to the previous lesson, and that's one example of Deixis, but we're now going to look at other examples of deictic language. And this is language that's used relative to a central position of the producer. So as you can see from the diagram there, the silhouettes I, you, he, she, they, the examples of grammatical perspective that we looked at are all fine examples of Deixis in that they show us a central speaker using the first person, contrasted with a kind of a personal distance between I and you, or I and he, she and they. But Deixis is also used to convey space, as in physical space, physical distance, here and there, for example, and it's also used to convey points in time, such as yesterday, tomorrow, or now. Deixis is language that has to be interpreted given a relative point in time. So it's language used around a central position. It can do more than that, though. It can also convey a sense of psychological relationships and values. And if you look at the examples of Deixis in the two memes there, we've got two people both looking in a sense of awe and wonder at two different things. In the what is that meme, the guy with the hat, we can't see exactly what he's looking at, but I guess it could be as physically close to him as the butterfly is to the guy in the butterfly meme. And yet that is used in one case and this is used in the other. Here's examples of what we would call proximal lexis, so related to, or spatial Deixis, sorry, related to distance, but we might say that creates a sense of an additional sense of distance, a sense of alienation, whereas this presents a sense of closeness or proximity. So in that way, Deixis can be more than about just physical space. It can also be about psychological relationships, i.e. closeness or familiarity. So here's some more detail in terms of picking apart the kinds of Deixis. We've already discussed that it can convey time, place and person, but a key distinction is between the proximal and the distal. And proximal Deixis is Deixis that conveys a close relationship, and distal Deixis is Deixis that conveys a distant relationship. And proximal forms often have or always have their distal equivalents. It's worth noting as you look at that table that there's a variety of different word types that can be deictic, and it isn't the case. Deixis is not itself a word class. On that list there are demonstrative pronouns, pronouns, adverbs, prepositions. So what determines Deixis is not the word type but the context. And this can be confusing because often students consider that, or often students are accused, especially by the exam board, of misidentifying Deixis in their responses. So in order to make sure that we don't do that, we can ask ourselves, is this example of language pointing to a central position? And could we substitute a proximal variant of the Deixis for a distal to change the meaning? That's a useful test that can help us ask if this language is really identifying the position relative to a central point. So here's a little bit of practice. A short extract in the red text box there from Handmaids, and the task is for you to pause the video at this point and to try and identify temporal, spatial and personal Deixis in the extract, and also to identify whether the proximal or the distal forms are being used. And are there any examples in there that could be misidentified as Deixis, i.e. examples of words that could be dectic in a different context, but in this context probably aren't? Pause the video, have a go, and shortly I'll respond with the answers. Okay, so as you can see, there are all three of the main kinds of Deixis are represented in this. We've got temporal Deixis last week. We've got spatial Deixis that is proximal here. And we've also got they and she. We've got distal examples of personal Deixis. The word there in this context is not being used in a dectic way. So we can't substitute the proximal here in that sentence and for it to still convey the same sense. So there is an example of where we might misidentify Deixis, because the there in that sentence at the end isn't necessarily or isn't really showing us a central point of the speech. Overall in that extract we get the distal temporal Deixis to show an event in the past, but we get the proximal spatial Deixis to convey close location, and this Deixis helps to create the Offred's perspective of standing in a significant spot where this violent event has happened but is no longer here in the present. So it's the Deixis in this short extract is conveying the way that Gilead covers up the brutality of its society, and it's perhaps concealed beneath the surface of this ordinary daily life. Here's a longer passage for you to examine to hone your use of Deixis. The task here is to pause the video again and to explore the way that Deixis is used in this extended passage from chapter 19. This passage describes a sort of a dream sequence in which spatial, personal and temporal time relationships are somewhat confused. Are you able to identify the different forms of Deixis used within that extract? But also now to give a more detailed account of the effect of those dectic choices, of how they perhaps convey a sense of disjointed or surreal experience. Pause the video, have a go. I've colour-coded the kinds of Deixis that I could pick out of this extract, and you can compare these to your own response. And I've given there in the text boxes more extended explanations. With regard to the temporal Deixis, we've got this present continuous verb form that creates a sense of the ongoing action of her dreaming in the present, and that has a sort of a framing function for the paragraph that follows. Then we get these temporal Deixis of when I was sick, which helps to shift the narration back into the past, and then this time which moves it back into the present. So the use of temporal Deixis here is helping to negotiate this movement in the narration from the present and into the past. The personal Deixis is also used meaningfully there between the description of the two people involved, well, three people. Obviously, Offred's central position as the person experiencing this dream is established there with the first person. But we've also got her language that she uses to describe her daughter and her mother. Using the third person of she and her for her daughter is perhaps more distal, has a greater distance than the possessive form of my that she uses for her mother. Could we interpret this as increasing her sense of loss that she feels over having been forcibly separated from her daughter? You could of course play with the effects and switch it round. She doesn't describe her daughter as my daughter, which adds this sense of distance. Spatial Deixis is also used in a way that conveys a kind of an out-of-body experience here. And the narrative is centered around Offred's room, and she negates this spatial Deixis of not this door, not this room, to show that the action she's experiencing is happening somewhere else, whilst also being where she is. That's a difficult thing to get a hold of, but it conveys kind of a contradiction in the spatial relationships in this narrative, that Offred knows where she is, she knows where her experiences are being centered, but her actual memory is taking place in this kind of vague, undefined location that's beyond the actual room that she's in. And then she uses spatial Deixis to bring herself back. I'm back in this bed. So you can see that Deixis is used here in really quite subtle and nuanced way to create a sense of time and space and person in this extract. One that is quite disjointed, but one that can be used to sort of evaluate the way that Offred is presenting her experiences. So then, in summary, Deixis is language that's used relative to a central position and can be categorized as a temporal Deixis, spatial Deixis, personal Deixis, or a discoursal Deixis, which is Deixis that refers to ideas or to speech. We can also think of Deixis in terms of the contrast between proximal, i.e. the close, the immediate, and the distal, which is the distant. Finally then, we've looked at the way that Deixis can create a central perspective and a central point for experience, but also how it can have these unique effects in terms of presenting movements and relationships forwards and backwards in time and in space and between individuals or characters. Thanks again for your attention. I hope this has been useful. Please use the information in these lessons to keep your notes up to date.